Disclaimer: this story is a work of adult-themed fiction created for entertainment purposes only. It does not encourage, promote, or glorify infidelity, inappropriate relationships, or harmful behavior. When I first married my husband, I believed I had finally stepped into the life I had always dreamed of. A stable home, financial security, and the promise of a family that felt complete. But dreams have a strange way of turning into realities you never expected. My husband, though a good provider and a man of discipline, was not the affectionate partner I had hoped for. He was practical, focused on work, and seemed to believe that love was proven through responsibility rather than emotion. That difference between us became more noticeable as the months turned into years. I found myself yearning for moments of closeness, a touch on the hand, an unexpected kiss, or even just a warm glance across the dinner table. Yet instead, I was often met with silence or hurried conversations about bills, schedules, or his workload. I convinced myself that this was just marriage settling into routine, but a part of me couldn't help but feel invisible. And then there was my stepson. He was 17, nearly an adult, and navigating his final years of high school. At first, my relationship with him was cautious. I didn't want to force myself into a role he wasn't ready to accept. Surprisingly, he welcomed me with a respect that went beyond mere politeness. He would help me set the table, ask about my day, or simply sit nearby when the house grew too quiet. Unlike his father, he noticed the little things, like when I cut my hair or wore a new dress. Of course, I told myself it was nothing. He was simply a considerate young man, the kind who had grown up learning how to treat others with kindness. But those small gestures filled the void that my marriage left behind. When my husband was away late into the night, or when he came home too tired to talk, it was often the stepson who reminded me I was still seen. He would crack a joke to make me laugh, or he'd ask if I wanted company while watching a movie. It was in those ordinary moments that I began to sense a dangerous undercurrent, something I refused to admit at the time. Because acknowledging it meant questioning not just my marriage, but myself. Still, the loneliness gnawed at me. The more absent my husband became, the more present his son seemed. And though I would never admit it aloud, that contrast made me feel conflicted. Looking back now, I realize that part one of this story is not about mistakes or betrayal. It's about the cracks that begin to form long before the fall. Cracks made of silence, neglect, and unmet needs. Cracks that grow wider each day, waiting for something or someone to slip inside them. Marriage has a way of slowly shifting its weight, pressing down on the cracks until they widen into something impossible to ignore. With each passing month, I found myself staring at the man I had married and wondering if he truly saw me anymore. My husband had always been hardworking, but lately, it felt like his career had consumed him completely. Long hours at the office, business trips that stretched from days into weeks, and when he was home, his mind seemed miles away. Dinner conversations became shorter, often dominated by him scrolling through his phone or responding to late-night emails. The intimacy we once shared, those tender touches, the inside jokes, the warmth of simply being together, had vanished. I began to feel like a shadow in my own home, performing my role as wife but no longer receiving the acknowledgement that role deserved. I tried to talk to him, to express how I felt, but my words were often brushed aside with a dismissive smile or a tired, "We'll talk later." Later never came. And in that silence, the space between us grew larger. I stopped expecting affection from him. I stopped waiting for him to notice me. But while his absence left me hollow, someone else in the house began to quietly fill that void: my stepson. It wasn't intentional at first. He was just being himself, a thoughtful young man who seemed to notice things his father no longer did. He would thank me after meals, even when his father barely looked up from his plate. He'd ask about my favorite shows or bring me a glass of water without being asked. They were small things, insignificant on their own, but when you are starved of attention, even the smallest gesture feels like a lifeline. I remember one evening in particular. My husband had once again canceled a dinner plan we'd made. I sat at the table with untouched food, feeling foolish for having set the candles and poured the wine. My stepson walked in, took one look at me, and without a word, sat down across the table. "You cooked all this," he said softly. "You shouldn't eat alone." He filled his plate and smiled as if to say, "I'm here." It was such a simple act, but it broke something inside me. From then on, I became hyper-aware of his presence. I noticed the way his eyes lingered when I laughed, the way he listened more carefully than his father ever did. I hated myself for noticing, but I couldn't ignore it. Each interaction carried an unspoken weight, something neither of us dared to name. And yet, I told myself it was harmless. That I was simply projecting my loneliness onto the one person who seemed to care. But deep down, I knew better. The distance between me and my husband wasn't just a gap anymore, it had become a canyon. And every day, I was inching closer to the edge. It happened on a night that, at first, seemed no different from the others. My husband was away again, claiming another late meeting that would likely end with him staying at a hotel near the office. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that settles in when everyone else is asleep. I sat alone in the bedroom, staring at the ceiling, my body restless and my mind heavy with thoughts I couldn't control. Loneliness can be a cruel thing. It doesn't just ache, it tempts. It whispers in your ear, convincing you to seek comfort in ways you never imagined you would. That night, I gave in. In the privacy of my room, I let myself escape, using my own hands to feel something, anything, that reminded me I was still alive, still a woman, still capable of pleasure even if my husband had long forgotten that part of me. I thought I was safe. The door wasn't locked, but why would it need to be? Everyone was asleep. Or so I believed. Then it happened. The door creaked, slowly at first, then wider. My heart stopped. Standing there, frozen in the doorway, was my stepson. His eyes widened, and for a moment, neither of us moved. My hand instinctively pulled away, my body jolting upright as shame and panic flooded me all at once. "Close the door," I whispered sharply, my voice trembling. He blinked, as if shaken from a dream, and quickly obeyed, but the damage was done. He had seen me. I sat there in the dim light, my heart racing, my hands shaking. Embarrassment burned my skin. What would he think of me? Would he tell his father? Would he look at me differently now? My mind spun with 100 fears. I wanted to pretend it hadn't happened, to erase the memory before it could root itself into reality. Minutes felt like hours before I finally dared to step out of the room. I expected him to avoid me, to hide away in his own embarrassment. But when our eyes met in the hallway, there was no anger, no disgust. Just a strange, unreadable softness in his gaze, as if he had seen more than my shame, he had seen my loneliness. That silent exchange unsettled me more than anything. Because in that look, I sensed something unspoken, something I was terrified to name. I lay awake the rest of the night, replaying the moment in my mind. The creak of the door, the shock on his face, the way he had looked at me afterward. I told myself it was a mistake, that we would never speak of it again. But deep down, I knew the night of discovery had changed everything. A boundary had been broken. And once broken, boundaries are rarely restored. The next morning, I braced myself for awkward silence, for avoidance, maybe even resentment. I expected my stepson to keep his distance, to act as though nothing had happened, or worse, to look at me with judgment in his eyes. But what I got was something I didn't anticipate at all. He came into the kitchen quietly, his hair still tousled from sleep, and sat down at the table. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just watched me as I moved around preparing breakfast. My hands trembled as I poured coffee, pretending everything was normal, though my mind was still trapped in the memory of last night. Finally, he broke the silence. "I'm sorry about last night," he said, his voice low, almost cautious. My breath caught, and I turned to face him. His eyes weren't mocking, nor were they cold. They were steady, filled with something closer to concern. "You weren't supposed to see that," I whispered, ashamed. I wanted to disappear, to undo it all. But then he said something that stopped me. "I get it," he murmured, looking down at his hands. "You're lonely." The words pierced deeper than I wanted to admit. He wasn't wrong. I had been lonely for so long, but hearing it spoken aloud, especially by him, made it real in a way I couldn't ignore. My lips parted, but no words came. What could I say? That my husband's absence had hollowed me out? That his indifference left me reaching for scraps of comfort? That I had become so desperate to feel alive that I'd risked everything? I don't think less of you, he continued, lifting his gaze back to mine. I understand. His compassion disarmed me. It should have been easier if he had been disgusted, if he had judged me. But instead, he offered something I hadn't expected, empathy. And that was more dangerous than anything else. Because in that moment, I felt seen in a way I hadn't been seen in years. The days that followed were filled with unspoken tension. He didn't avoid me. In fact, he seemed more present. He would linger longer in the kitchen, help with chores without being asked, and sometimes his eyes would meet mine for just a second too long. Those looks carried weight that both of us felt, but neither dared to acknowledge. I told myself repeatedly to put distance between us, to make sure nothing more could ever happen. But every attempt failed, because deep down, a part of me didn't want the distance. His presence had become a comfort I couldn't bring myself to reject. It wasn't just about what he had seen, it was about what he had understood. He saw the woman behind the role of stepmother, the wife abandoned by her husband, the person craving connection. And in seeing me that way, he gave me something I had almost forgotten I deserved, attention. Looking back, that was the turning point. Not the night of discovery, but the morning after, when instead of shame, I felt the first spark of something far more dangerous. The line between right and wrong is often clear when you're far from it. You tell yourself you'd never cross it, that you'd recognize the danger long before it became real. But when you're standing on that line, trembling from both fear and longing, the edges blur. That was where I found myself, with my stepson, in a house that had grown colder with each passing day. It began innocently, or at least that's what I told myself. One evening, the power went out during a storm. My husband was away yet again, leaving just the two of us in the dim glow of candles. We sat together in the living room, the sound of rain battering the windows. Conversation started cautiously: school, his plans for the future, little things to fill the silence. But as the minutes stretched on, the space between us shrank. At one point, lightning flashed, and I flinched. He noticed and laughed softly. Scared, he teased. I rolled my eyes, but then his hand brushed against mine. Just a fleeting touch. Still, it sent a current through me stronger than the storm outside. I should have pulled away. I should have stood up, found a reason to leave the room. But I didn't. I stayed. I let the silence grow heavier, let his eyes linger longer. And when he whispered, "You don't have to be alone," I felt my resolve unravel. The kiss happened before I realized I had allowed it. Tentative at first, hesitant, almost as if he was giving me a chance to stop him. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned in. And in that single moment, the line we had been dancing around shattered completely. My mind screamed with guilt, but my body betrayed me. It had been years since I felt desired, years since anyone had looked at me the way he did. His touch wasn't careless. It was careful, almost reverent, as if he had been waiting for me to acknowledge what had been building between us all along. When it ended, when the storm quieted and the power flickered back to life, reality returned with crushing weight. I pulled away, breathless and shaken. "This can't happen again," I whispered, more to myself than to him. But even as I said it, I knew the words were hollow. He looked at me with a steady calm, not a trace of regret in his eyes. "I know what you need," he said softly. "And I want to be that for you." I should have been horrified, should have slammed the door on what we had just done. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, wanted, desired, alive. That night was supposed to be an exception, a mistake we would bury. But mistakes like that don't stay buried. They grow roots. And once we had crossed the line, there was no going back. After that stormy night, I told myself it was a one-time mistake, something born out of loneliness and vulnerability, something I would never allow again. But temptation doesn't vanish once it's been tasted. Instead, it lingers, waiting for the next quiet moment, the next excuse, the next spark. And soon, our stolen kiss grew into something deeper, something far more dangerous. It began in subtle ways. A brush of his hand as he passed me in the hallway. A look held a second too long during dinner. The unspoken tension between us became unbearable, and eventually, The secrecy itself fed the attraction. The more forbidden it was, the more we craved it. When my husband was away, which was often, the house became ours. We would sit closer on the couch, whispering like co-conspirators, our laughter filling the silence his absence left behind. What started as hesitant touches evolved into late-night rendezvous. At first, I justified it as harmless, moments of companionship I desperately needed. But before long, the truth was undeniable. We were having an affair. Every encounter was a mix of ecstasy and guilt. In his arms, I felt alive, desired, and seen. Yet every time it ended, shame clawed its way back into me. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, asking myself how I had let things go so far. I was betraying my husband, yes, but I was also betraying myself, crossing boundaries I once believed unshakable. But guilt wasn't the only thing growing. So was his possessiveness. My stepson, once gentle and reserved, began showing signs of jealousy. If I laughed at a text from a friend, his expression would darken. If my husband called, he would retreat into cold silence, as though reminded that I belonged to someone else. I tried to remind him of the reality. We could never be open, never exist beyond shadows. But the more I said it, the more he seemed determined to keep me as his. Living a double life wore on me. With my husband, I played the dutiful wife, smiling at dinners, pretending his absence didn't sting. With my stepson, I was someone entirely different, a woman who had found passion again, who felt wanted, who could still inspire longing. Balancing those two identities was exhausting, and every day felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of consequences. There were close calls too. A door creaked open at the wrong moment, footsteps echoed in the hallway when they shouldn't have, a misplaced item nearly revealing we hadn't been as careful as we thought. Each scare left me shaken, vowing that it had to end, but then his hand would find mine again, and all my resolve would crumble. The affair was no longer just a secret, it was an addiction. And like all addictions, it carried the seed of destruction. I knew it couldn't last forever. Secrets like ours always find a way of surfacing. The only question was when. Every secret has an expiration date, and ours was no exception. By then, the affair had woven itself into the fabric of my life, filling the empty spaces my marriage had left hollow. But living between two worlds couldn't go on forever. The cracks were starting to show, and the pressure of being discovered grew heavier with each passing day. It began with small suspicions. My husband, usually too preoccupied with work to notice much, started asking subtle questions. Why was his son spending so much time at home instead of going out with friends? Why did I seem distracted during conversations? Why did the air feel heavier whenever all three of us were in the same room? His tone wasn't accusatory yet, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that hinted at doubt. One evening, my stepson made a careless mistake. We were sitting too close on the couch, laughter spilling out louder than it should have, when the front door opened earlier than expected. My husband stepped inside, and though nothing explicit had happened, the sight of us together raised a silent alarm. I saw it in his eyes, suspicion, flickering like a match ready to ignite. From that moment, paranoia ruled me. Every text, every glance, every interaction felt like a potential betrayal waiting to be uncovered. I avoided my husband's gaze, overcompensated with forced affection, and distanced myself from my stepson in public moments. But behind closed doors, the pull between us only grew stronger, fueled by fear as much as desire. The tension reached a boiling point one night when my stepson confronted me. His voice was sharper than I had ever heard it. "You can't keep pretending with him," he said, his jaw tight. "You belong with me." The words struck me with both longing and terror. I wanted to believe him, wanted to surrender to the fantasy he painted, but reality clung to me like chains. "We can't," I whispered, fighting tears. "You don't understand the cost." But he did understand, at least, in his own way. His frustration grew into anger, not at me, but at the life that kept us hidden. That night, I realized the danger wasn't just in being caught, it was in how far he was willing to go to keep me. Meanwhile, my husband's questions became sharper. He noticed my late-night wanderings, the way I avoided intimacy with him, the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from me. His patience was thinning, and I could feel him circling closer to the truth. I stood at the breaking point, torn between two lives that could no longer coexist. The weight of my choices pressed down on me, suffocating. I knew something was going to give, whether through confession, exposure, or a slip neither of us could control. The secret we had guarded so fiercely was now a ticking time bomb. And it was only a matter of time before it exploded. The truth didn't stay buried for long. Secrets like ours never do. It wasn't a dramatic revelation at first, no screaming confrontation, no sudden discovery. It was more subtle, more suffocating. My husband's suspicion had been building for weeks, and when the pieces finally connected, his silence was louder than any outburst could have been. I still remember the night he confronted me. We were sitting at the dinner table, the three of us. His fork clattered against the plate, and then he looked directly at me with eyes I no longer recognized. "How long?" he asked simply. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of every betrayal, every disappointment. My stepson froze, his face pale, his hands clenched tight. There was no denying it. The truth was written across my face, trembling in my silence. I didn't need to speak, because my husband already knew. The rage that followed was cold, not fiery. He didn't shout, didn't throw things. Instead, he stood, walked away from the table, and left the house without another word. That silence hurt more than any explosion of anger ever could. In the days that followed, everything unraveled. My husband filed for divorce almost immediately. The trust between him and his son shattered beyond repair, and the fragile bond we had built as a family was gone. I became the fracture point, the reason their relationship collapsed. My stepson, once so certain of what he wanted, began to see the reality he hadn't considered. Without secrecy, our connection wasn't thrilling anymore. It was toxic, heavy with consequences neither of us could carry. He pulled away, retreating back into his own world, leaving me with nothing but the echoes of what we'd done. And I was left alone. No husband. No family. No comfort in the arms that had once made me feel alive. Just silence, and the heavy knowledge that one night of loneliness had cost me everything I thought I had secured. Looking back now, I see how easily the path was laid. Neglect turned into longing. Longing turned into temptation. Temptation into action. And action into ruin. It was a chain reaction I thought I could control, but in truth, I had surrendered the moment I let myself believe I was invisible in my own marriage. This is not a story of passion. It's not even a story of love. It's a story of choices, choices that shattered a family and destroyed the trust of everyone involved. And it serves as a reminder, infidelity doesn't begin in the bedroom. It begins in silence, in distance, in the cracks that go unnoticed until it's too late. I live with the consequences every day. The loneliness I once feared has become permanent, but now it carries the weight of guilt as well. I traded stability for desire, comfort for chaos, and in the end, I lost it all. That's the truth of this story. Not the scandal, not the whispers, but the ruin left behind when boundaries are broken and trust is betrayed. 68.